Violent inclement weather has devastated the coastal province of South Africa over the last couple of days, with storms, a tornado, and various other weather patterns of abnormality destroying homes as well as entire communities. Dr. Anthony Turton from the Center for Environmental Management at the University of Free State joins us to unpack this. Prof, is this the end or is there more to come?
Good evening to you and the listeners. It's difficult to say if things are getting worse than they were before, because firstly, I defer here to some credible work that's been done by Professor Roland Schulze of the University of KZN, who's put a very credible document together to show that there's always been very, very bad weather along the KZN coast, certainly as far back as recorded history goes. So whether it's getting worse or not, I don't know. I think what is happening is that the population density around certain areas is growing at such a rate, and that the development is taking place on land that in many cases is not suitable for dense populations. And I think this is probably what gives the impression that the weather events are becoming more and more of a very, very serious hazard in KZN.
Is the weather as devastating as the results appear to be, or were communities, cities, towns, and the environmental organizations just poorly planned for this?
Living in KZN myself, I don't think that the planning is done properly. That's my personal view. I think that too many developments have been allowed to take place in inappropriate areas. And we see a lot of political pressure being placed on various councils to actually grow the local economy by means of settling people. We see this all along the coast. We see it particularly in the Western Cape as well. So it's not just the KZN phenomena. But I think that the first thing is that people are developing on inappropriate land. I think that's happening. I think there is a degree of corruption taking place in that the necessary permits are not always correctly done. In other words, the environmental impact assessments, various engineering design standards are not always necessarily correctly done, and we've seen a lot of that in KZN. And then, of course, I think we've also just seen the impact of some really serious events. Just last week we had this tornado. I don't know if it was one that became many, or if it was multiple tornadoes. I don't know, but I just know that it was really quite a serious event. And we're starting to see more and more of that type of thing in KZN now. In fact, where I live in Potchefstroom area, there was 190 millimeters of rain in about a 24-hour period, which is a serious amount of rain, given that this is not actually the real heavy rainy season. So I think this is something for the future. I think that KZN is increasingly going to become the epicenter of very, very severe weather events. And now it comes down to the question of what is the government's capacity to cope. What is the government capacity for early warning? Because what I see happening right now is that the government has not even managed to repair the damage done in 2020, and now in 2024 we're dealing with serious events again. So the question is, how do we catch up to these serious events?
Let's go back to the KZN case, because you mentioned their population density as part of what may be an exacerbating factor over there. How important is population movement management in disaster management and prevention controls?
I think this is a huge issue. I mean, we see this playing out in Hermanus at the moment now, where Hermanus is a very well-run municipality generally, but the preference there is to allow people to migrate to that area. So all policies are geared to settling people, but of course there are environmental limitations. In this case, there's water from the De Bos Dam, which is one of the main water supply areas for that particular municipality, and then there's the environmental releases that are needed, which are now competing with development. So it's happening not only in KZN. I think the place to watch would be Hermanus. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening there, but certainly if you look at the north coast of KZN, just a huge number of developments, and that's all built on sand. It's all built on inappropriate sites. So your storm drainage and the design of these storm systems is of great importance, because when you've got 200 millimeters of rain being dumped as a regular matter now, in a relatively short space of time, the runoff from a built-up area is massive. Yeah. And I don't think that the existing design standards cater for that.
Dr. Turton, inclement weather doesn't necessarily mean unpredictable weather. Do we have enough meteorological data, and do we move agile and quickly enough when we have meteorological data that suggests to us that we may have a situation where we have floods, a tornado, and various other forms of inclement weather conditions?
Well, meteorological data nowadays is all supplied mostly by satellite. I mean, you could see these systems forming out over the ocean, in real time. So I don't see that there's a shortage of meteorological data that's a factor. What I do think is a problem is that the interpretation of that data and then the institutionalization of that, as to how that interpreted data is now fed out to the communities, especially in terms of early warnings. Although KZN does have an early warning system that seems to work fairly well. So I guess anything can be improved upon, but I would say that the KZN early warning system is relatively good. These tornadoes, however, this to me is something that is somewhat of an anomaly, and I'm not sure if we're going to be seeing more of that in the future. But I mean, when a tornado hits, it can be quite devastating in a very, very localized area, but absolutely totally devastating. So I think this is something to look forward to in the future.
Yeah. What in our meteorological data can describe to us why coastal provinces in particular are so vulnerable?
Well, because it's a moot point now whether the oceans are changing. We know that the oceans are generally becoming slightly warmer than before, and as they become slightly warmer, we just need a slight incremental change. So we don't need many degrees of change to start changing the fundamental principles, because you must remember that about 2/3 of the planet, maybe even more, is made up of ocean. So most of the global weather is driven by the oceans. Yeah. And even just a slight temperature increase over the ocean changes the capacity of that water to be absorbed into the atmosphere. So, you get your clouds being formed from water evaporating off the ocean. Because it's warmer, now we get more and more air carrying water, in other words, saturated water. And because the systems seem to be moving slower now, they hold their dumping pattern in a tight area for a relatively long period of time. So, I mean, in KZN, we can get massive amounts of water dumped over a few days of time. Yeah. And this to me is something that is quite unusual, because it's not just a storm that moves in and out again. These things are persistent, and they stay for a few days.
Prof, thank you so much for that. You just gave me a flashback to what felt like grade 6 natural science classrooms. But really appreciate that explanation, Ria. It helps us a great deal to make sense of this. Dr. Anthony Turton from the Center for Environmental Management at the University of the Free State.